The filibuster. In order to make something like this successful, I think it is necessary to try to anticipate what the opposition would say and how they would react to it. Such as, the Democrats could try to twist and spin this to say that they're the Smith character, and that the filibuster is obviously a good thing because it stops the corrupt establishment from shutting out the small guy who righteously just wants to have his piece heard. Never mind that the Dems are the most striking example of the corrupt establishment themselves, because in order to be a leftist, you have to twist everything to make it conform to your banal political agenda. The Republicans are not immune to this, and deserve an equal share of ire for their own lack of virtue and their growing indiscretions. So let's talk about the filibuster. The filibuster is presented as being a thing of virtue in Mr. Smith, and for good reason, because in that fictional universe, it was. Because Mr. Smith didn't know anything about legislation nor the rules, he couldn't figure out how to get a word in edgewise. Through the help of his assistant and love interest, Miss Saunders, he was able to take advantage of the filibuster rule and hold the floor until he could say his piece, in an attempt to clear his name from the made-up charges levied against him in order to silence him. That isn't actually how Senate filibusters work, though, so beware taking it too seriously. It was a necessary MacGuffin for the plot and climax in the Mr. Smith movie, but it doesn't really reflect reality. The way filibusters work now is during committee or during a Senate floor debate, you have unlimited time to discuss bills provided a senator keeps talking, and only yields the floor to the other senators who also want to keep talking, so bills can't be voted on in committee or on the floor. In order to break a filibuster, senators have to vote for cloture, which means closing the discussion and moving on to vote on the bill, and that according to current rules can only be done with 3/5 vote to invoke cloture, which requires 60 Senate votes. If the Senate can't make it to 60 votes, the debate doesn't end until the Senate leadership decides to recess for the day. Hence why so much legislation these days is done via reconciliation, which allows members of each majority in each house to talk to one another and write and set the bill, so the final vote can come without adding extra time to debate. This is done slowly and exclusively to avoid filibusters, going against explicitly what the founders suggested in their writings and how they operated the legislature themselves. It is a method of delaying legislation, trying to push it to the back of the pile or fill up the debate surrounding it with so much chuffa that it can't be voted on properly. This isn't a constitutional thing either. There is nothing in the Constitution which allows or forbids a filibuster. That comes from the way the Senate rules were formed, when the Senate begins its first session in a new legislative year. The Senate itself was not founded with this rule, as it did not become anything resembling its current form until Senate Rule 22 was changed in 1975. It set the threshold vote at 60 to invoke cloture, and changed the way filibusters were done dramatically. Now, senators don't even have to talk, or be on the floor to talk, to delay a vote. They can simply state their intent to filibuster, then leave. They can now filibuster from their offices or even their house, because you don't have to hold the floor, or fill time to do it. Just stating your intent is enough to effectively shut down the legislative process, utterly and completely, forever. You don't even have to put any effort into it like Mr. Smith did. This was never the founders' intent. They specifically warned against what would become a filibuster, and even using rules like the 60 vote for cloture for day-to-day legislative business. The House of Representatives dropped the filibuster decades ago, taking the founders' advice so eloquently laid out in Federalist No. 58 and Federalist No. 22. The author of the Federalist No. 58, James Madison, knows a thing or two about the Constitution, as it was basically his idea to begin with and most of it came directly from his pen. Writing under the pseudonym Publius, he said, "In all cases where justice or the general good might require new laws to be passed, or active measures to be pursued, the fundamental principle of a free government would be reversed. It would be no longer the majority that would rule, the power would be transferred to the minority." Or Alexander Hamilton, who in Federalist No. 22 said, "To give a minority a negative upon the majority, which is always the case where more than a majority is requisite to a decision, is, in its tendency, to subject the sense of the greater number to that of the lesser." The necessity of unanimity in public bodies, or of something approaching towards it, has been founded upon a supposition that it would contribute to security. But its real operation is to embarrass the administration, to destroy the energy of the government, and to substitute the pleasure, caprice, and artifices of an insignificant, turbulent, or corrupt junto to the regular deliberations and decisions of a respectable majority. It is often, by the impracticality of obtaining the concurrence of necessary number of votes, kept in a state of inaction. Its situation must always savor weakness, or sometimes border upon anarchy. So we know the founders were suspicious of allowing the legislative minority power over the majority, and knew that it caused gridlock and stagnated the government, which would be nothing more than a corrupting influence on said government, but also the lack of virtue on the people the government reflected. The notion, which comes to us today via the filibuster and cloture, was something we know historically breaks governments and makes the consent of the governed, the very bedrock of the U.S. social contract, moot and unrespectable. So before the left makes the case, allow me to counter it by urging and advocating the removal of the 60-vote rule in the Senate, and the move to a 51-vote cloture, as the founders did it, and as they intended us to do it. The best way to do this would be to convince the next majority leader in the Senate to change the rules from the onset, once a new sitting Congress is convened after this year. Each new Congress sets their own rules, though typically they merely just adopt the previous Congress's rules for convenience. The change had come in when they set up Rule 22, by removing the 60-vote threshold for cloture completely and changing it back to a simple majority of 51 votes. Don't let anyone fool you. The left argued the same point when they were in a majority control, and did effectively change Rule 22 in order to remove the 60-vote cloture from the rule itself, as it pertained to judicial appointments. They threw out the rule because the Republicans were interfering with their ability to vote on Obama's judicial appointees. Likewise, the Republicans, when they got a majority, expanded the rule to apply to Supreme Court nominations as well. Both sides were filibustering the normal work of government, and both sides changed the rule to allow them to get on with it. Why pussyfoot around it? Remove the 60-vote rule and stop having to worry about it completely. It is what the founders wanted because they knew a functioning government was more important than a perpetually frozen government, especially when the freeze is something levied by the minority to effectively control the majority. With that, I thank you if you stuck through this all the way. I hope you like the movie, and I hope you're buttressed against the counterattack should anything come of this idea. And I hope you feel the near overwhelming rapture at the prospect of a good, strong, and functioning America, as I do after I watch this movie. I think something like this, where the expert storytelling and artistic vision of the filmmakers can better express what is good about America, as a people and as an ideal than I ever could, is necessary, and at the moment a completely underutilized tool. I hope it somehow makes its way to President Trump too, because I think him doing something like this, then repeating it incrementally with other subject matter, via internet streams to bypass the corrupt media, would make the notion of what America was supposed to be, and what it used to be in contrast to what it is now, very clear. I don't think he can lose if he continues to tap into the people and give them not only what they want, but what they need. Likewise, it builds the reserve of personal virtue and respect for the American people, and thus makes the government better by incidental fiat. With that, I thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.